You are a Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighter pilot in 4. Blinding sun streams through the plexiglass canopy. But inside, the cold sting of tension grips you. A pungent, resinous smell, unlike clean, high-octane gasoline, hits your nose. It's the stench of smoke and despair. The engine runs unevenly, with a faint, unsettling vibration. The fuel gauge quivers at the red line, showing only minutes of flight remaining. You know this fuel isn't in army depots. No tankers brought it from distant Indonesia. This fuel, smelling of turpentine and burned wood, is being literally torn from the soil by exhausted old men and schoolchildren, whose calligraphy lessons have been replaced by a decree of universal labour conscription for victory fuel. While one of the world's greatest industrial powers struggled to keep its planes in the air with surrogate fuel produced by a virtually medieval pyrolysis technology, its primary enemy was doing something unimaginable. Thousands of kilometres away, the United States of America was building something the world had never seen. They weren't uprooting stumps, they were laying a river of steel, the Big Inch Project, an underground artery of steel, 61 centimetres in diameter and 2,500 kilometres long, through which oil flowed with the hum of pumping stations. A torrent of such power that in a single day it transported over 300,000 barrels of oil, more than all of Japan could produce from its forests in an entire year of desperate, grueling labour. This is a story of two philosophies of survival, of two ways of thinking in conditions of total war, a story of how pragmatic, engineering genius clashed with ideological national despair. By the end of this account, you will understand how access to resources and a strategic mindset determine not only the outcome of battles, but also the fate of entire generations, leaving behind either humming arteries of progress or deep, unhealing scars on the land and in the memory of a nation. Before the war, the Japanese Empire seemed like a perfectly tuned mechanism. Its Shokaku-class aircraft carriers plied the oceans, its factories in Osaka and Yokohama hummed, operating at full capacity. But this steel giant had one critical vulnerability: its Achilles' heel. It was incredibly, totally hungry, and its food was oil, the pulsating blood of modern warfare. Oil, of which there was virtually none on the Japanese islands. Imagine, every litre of gasoline powering the engines of Zero fighters and Chiha tanks was imported. This dependence was an open secret, a ticking time bomb embedded in the very heart of the imperial war machine. And on July 26, 1941, the United States made its move. It wasn't the roar of cannons or the wail of sirens. It was the quiet but thunderous stroke of President Roosevelt's pen on an order to freeze Japanese assets. America imposed a complete oil embargo. With a single political decision, without a single shot fired, Washington simply turned off the spigot that supplied 80% of all Japanese oil imports. For Tokyo, it was an ultimatum written in invisible ink. The war machine, designed for years of global dominance, suddenly heard its engines begin to sputter, left with only a few critical months of fuel reserves. The most striking thing here is that the Imperial General Staff was perfectly aware of its vulnerability. They had analysed this scenario for years, but instead of seeking diplomatic compromise, the ideology of Hakko Ichiu, Japan's divine destiny to rule Asia, and militaristic stubbornness pushed them to the riskiest step. They decided they could blitzkrieg oil-rich regions of the Dutch East Indies faster than the nation's fuel gauge needle dropped to zero. They gambled the fate of the empire in a desperate race against time. There was no backup plan. Thus, Japan, blinded by its own ambitions, voluntarily stepped into a resource trap from which it would have to seek a desperate, almost insane way out. But while it prepared for this leap into the abyss, its future enemy, America, faced a completely different problem. A problem that came not from the quiet of political offices, but from the icy, dark depths of the Atlantic Ocean, where the ominous acoustic signal of German sonar was already audible. Night. The cold Atlantic, and 42, the air hangs thick with the smell of salt and machine oil. Off the east coast of the US, barely discernible in the darkness, a tanker's silhouette moves slowly, its diesels emitting a low guttural rumble. It carries vital cargo, crude oil from Texas to New Jersey refineries. Suddenly, without warning, a white torpedo trail pierces the water. A second of deafening silence, and then a crushing impact, the screech of tearing metal. A fireball erupts skyward, ripping open the ship's side and turning thousands of tons of oil into a roaring, blazing inferno. In the icy water amidst burning oil slicks, survivors struggle, while on the horizon, silently, like a predator, a German submarine submerges. This is Operation Paukenschlag. Admiral Dönitz's wolf packs unleashed a veritable slaughter off America's very shores. The sea route, which for centuries had been the country's main transport artery, became Torpedo Alley. The industries and the military of the East Coast, vital to the war effort, risked running out of fuel, and then a man with a reputation as difficult but impeccably honest administrator stepped onto the scene. Harold Ickes, the US Secretary of the Interior. He proposed an idea that oil barons and even some military officials considered pure madness. If oil couldn't be safely transported by sea, he reasoned, then a new torpedo-proof river must be created. A river of steel flowing underground, hidden from enemy eyes across the entire continent. The project was codenamed Big Inch. Its scale was unprecedented in world engineering. No one in the world had ever built a pipeline of such a diameter, a colossal 61 centimetres. No one had laid it over such a distance, 2,500 kilometres, crossing the Appalachian Mountains, traversing dozens of rivers, including the mighty Mississippi, and biting into viscous swamps. The country's leading engineers wrote in their reports that it was on the verge of what was technologically possible. Economists, looking at the budget, doubted its profitability. But Ickes, pounding his fist on the table in the Oval Office, insisted. He convinced the government that it was not a matter of money, but a matter of national survival. So the United States, faced with an external crisis, responded with the most ambitious engineering project of its time, defying the laws of physics and logistics, armed with thousands of tons of steel and the might of bulldozers. What kind of response to its internal, much deeper and existential fuel crisis was Japan preparing at this time, a nation that had neither steel nor bulldozers? Imagine the Ministry of Munitions office in Tokyo. The air, thick and still, is permeated with the smell of tobacco smoke and old paper. Reports lie on the lacquered table, each number a hammer blow, oil reserves dwindling, captured fields in Borneo, unable to meet all needs, the combined fleet and air force demanding more and more. In this atmosphere of suffocating hopelessness, an idea is born. An idea dictated not by cold calculation, but by despair mixed with a fanatical belief in the inexhaustible Japanese spirit. If there is no oil underground, we will extract it from what grows on our sacred land. From pine trees, the decision is made, launch a nationwide program to produce fuel from pine roots. The technology they relied on was as old as time, dry distillation of wood or pyrolysis. Across the country, right in the forests, thousands of primitive kilns began to be built, often constructed from clay stones and old barrels. Uprooted roots and stumps were slowly heated in these sealed chambers without oxygen, filling the air with acrid, suffocating smoke. From the high temperature, the wood sweated, releasing resin and combustible gas. This viscous black liquid was then attempted to be distilled into some semblance of gasoline. It was a technological gamble, absurd in its essence. The energy costs of uprooting, transporting and distilling often exceeded the energy that could be obtained from the final low-quality product. And now the main shocking fact that, according to post-war archives, illustrates the utter madness of this project. To produce just 1 litre of low-quality dirty aviation fuel, which clogged fuel filters and caused premature piston wear, required uprooting, drying and processing resin from approximately 200 pine stumps. 200 stumps, 1 litre. To fuel 1 fighter for 1 sortie, an entire grove had to be emptied. This was not industry. It was a ritual of national sacrifice where their own forests were offered as tribute. The project was doomed from the start, both economically and technologically. Any independent engineer could have proven it. But the propaganda machine, with its posters and radio broadcasts was about miracle fuel, was working at full throttle, and it was launched. However, to implement this gigantic and meaningless plan, a resource was needed that could replace steel and machines. And since Japan no longer had technology or oil, it decided to use its last, most valuable and most vulnerable resource, its own children. His name is Kenji. He is 14 years old. Instead of calligraphy class, where his fingers were accustomed to the smoothness of brush and ink, he and his entire class are taken to a cold, damp forest. Each is given a crude pickaxe or shovel. The task for the day, for the week, for the month: uproot stumps. This is not just work, it is torture, heavy, monotonous, muscle-tearing labour. Hands that had known nothing heavier than a bamboo pen are almost immediately covered in bloody blisters from the rough, splintery handles. His back aches with continuous dull pain. In his nostrils is the pervasive, nauseating smell of damp earth, decaying pine needles and pungent pine resin, which will haunt his dreams. He and millions like him, schoolchildren, students, old people, became the main unarmed army in this battle for pine roots. Why children? The logic of the imperial staff was cruel and direct, like a bayonet thrust. All adult men capable of bearing arms were on fronts from Manchuria to New Guinea. Factory workers toiled 3 shifts to exhaustion, smelting the last steel. Human resources were depleted. Under the national mobilization law, middle and high school education was effectively cancelled. Desks were replaced by pickaxes. The nation's future, its education, its health, its hopes, were thrown into the furnace of war as the cheapest and, as they thought, infinitely renewable resource. For new children would be born, but new oil would not. Now imagine a crosscut. Under the same sun, but across the ocean, 16,000 American workers were building the Big Inch. These were not mobilized teenagers. They were professional welders, engineers, and drivers, earning high wages by wartime standards and receiving 3 hot meals a day. Instead of fragile hands and wooden shovels, diesel engines of Caterpillar bulldozers roared over the trenches. Arc welding machines hissed, permanently joining gigantic pipe sections. Cranes and pipe layers, resembling prehistoric monsters, moved along. They worked hard in mud and rain, but their labor was meaningful, highly efficient, and brilliantly organized. To the hum of engines, mixed with jokes and work chatter, they built a steel artery of the future. Japanese schoolchildren, in the deafening dead silence of the forest, unknowingly uprooted their own. The human costs were incomparable. It was a battle of steel against flesh, engineering ingenuity against ideological coercion. On one side, organized, paid labor of free people, multiplied by the colossal power of machines. On the other, forced, slave labor of children, based on propaganda and total hopeless despair. Both nations made titanic efforts, investing everything they had in victory. But what were the real, measurable in barrels and litres, technical results of these 2 absolutely different approaches to survival? Here are the results. Expressed in metal and smoke. 1943, America. This is not a forest where the dry thud of an axe is heard. This is a continent transformed into a single vibrating assembly plant. From the scorching oil fields of Texas to the ports of New Jersey, the earth is scarred by a giant wound, a trench 1.5 meters deep smelling of damp clay and diesel fuel. In it, like the spine of a mythical steel beast, giant pipes are laid. 16,000 workers in 3 shifts. The piercing roar of excavators mixes with the deafening clang of metal against metal. The blinding hiss of thousands of welding machines, melting steel at a temperature of 1,500 degrees, never ceases day or night. Joint by joint, kilometre by kilometre, they assemble the longest steel river in human history. This is not just construction, it is a deafening symphony of organised power. The Big Inch project was a triumph of engineering. The pipe diameter, 61 centimetres, enough to pump over 300,000 barrels of oil every day under a pressure of 52 atmospheres. The key to success was total standardisation. All pipe sections were identical down to the millimetre. They were mass-produced in factories and only welded on site. Specially designed pipe-bending machines, true steel monsters, effortlessly bent thick-walled steel to navigate hills. Powerful pumping stations installed every 80 kilometres emitted a low, continuous hum, pushing the black gold forward. This was not just a pipe. It was a perfectly tuned logistical system created for one purpose: to inject high-octane blood into the Allied war machine, regardless of the wolf packs in the ocean. Now let's cross the ocean at the very same time. In the Japanese forests, there is no roar of excavators. Instead, the quiet, ominous crackle of burning logs and acrid, suffocating smoke that stings the throat and drifts between the trees. There is no steel and no pumping stations. Instead, thousands of primitive pyrolysis kilns moulded from clay and stones. Into these smoking hearths of despair, schoolchildren and old people load uprooted pine roots sticky with resin. The wood slowly smoulders, and drop by drop, a dark brown viscous liquid flows into clay pots. This is Japan's answer to the Big Inch. thousands of smoking kilns producing a few barrels of muddy liquid a day, a liquid that could barely be called quality aviation fuel, even with a stretch. A river of steel versus smoke from a kiln, automated logistics versus grueling manual labour, engineering calculation versus ideological stubbornness. The Pacific War was not just a battle of armies and fleets, it was a clash of two production philosophies, two fundamentally different realities, and the outcome of this battle was predetermined not on the battlefields of Guadalcanal, but here, in American trenches, smelling of steel, and in the smoke-filled air of Japanese forests. One system was creating the future, pumping the energy of progress, the other was burning its past, present, and the future of its children. On August 14, 1943, at the Phoenixville oil refinery in Pennsylvania, the air was electric with anticipation. Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes, the man who had staked his reputation on this project, stood by the outlet valve. He felt a light, deep vibration in the ground beneath his boots. Around him were engineers, workers, and reporters with flashing cameras. A heavy sense, and then, first a barely audible hum in the pipe, then a powerful, confident surge that made the metal vibrate more strongly. The workers turned the valve, and thick, warm oil, smelling of the power and the Earth's depths, from Texas, having travelled 2,500 kilometres underground through rocks and under riverbeds, burst out. It was not just a flow of fuel, it was the low-frequency hum of victory, drowning out the roar of German torpedoes in the Atlantic. Ickes didn't smile. He simply watched as the Steel River, born of his will, reached its destination. The completion of the Big Inch marked a fundamental turning point in Allied logistics. The threat from German submarines sinking tankers off the coast was strategically neutralized. Now, the military factories, shipyards, and airfields of the US East Coast received oil uninterruptedly in any quantity, in any weather. The Big Inch and its younger brother, the Little Big Inch, which carried finished petroleum products, became the steel arteries of American war industry. They allowed the production of Sherman tanks and B-29 bombers at a pace that turned the Axis powers' production plans to dust. This showed the world that America, the arsenal of democracy, solved problems not only with the force of arms, but also with the power of engineering ingenuity and absolutely overwhelming resource superiority. And now the most astonishing fact. The very essence of this story expressed in numbers. Let's compare the scales. In a single day, the Big Inch pumped over 300,000 barrels of oil to the east. Now, listen carefully to this. Japan's entire national program for extracting fuel from pine roots throughout its entire existence could not produce even that daily volume. All the titanic labour of millions of people, all the destroyed forests, all the health and hopes of children thrown into this smoking furnace, all this national strain proved to be a statistical error compared to the daily output of one American engineering solution. The United States secured its victory with steel, calculation, and organization. Japan marched toward defeat, burning its own land and the souls of its children in a desperate attempt to create a miracle from nothing. The war was drawing to a close, but what became of these gigantic projects when the weapons fell silent? What happens to a river of steel when the enemy for whom it was created disappears? And what remains after the smoke from thousands of funeral pyres for pine forests, besides bitter ashes and memories? 1950, Japan, on the mountain slopes where ancient pine forests rustled just 10 years earlier, now lies bare, scarred earth. A piercing wind sweeps across the wasteland. Rains wash away the thin layer of soil, exposing barren clay and stones. Almost nothing grows here. Up these slopes, where a shovel clangs against stone, people slowly ascend. The same former schoolchildren, now grown men and women with dulled eyes. In their hands are not axes, but saplings. They return to the sites of their forced labour to try and mend what was done. They plant tiny pines in the dead earth, knowing they will not see them grow to maturity. This is work not for years, but for generations, quiet, penitent labour on land scarred not by enemy weapons, but by their own madness. The consequences of Japan's fuel project turned out to be an ecological catastrophe. Mass deforestation and root uprooting triggered a cascading collapse of ecosystems that had developed over centuries. The soil, deprived of its root framework, no longer retained moisture, leading to widespread erosion, landslides, and the drying up of rivers. Many species of animals and plants disappeared. The reforestation program begun after the war required decades of hard work and colossal investment. Economically, the project was a black hole, consuming invaluable human and natural capital, and the ecological damage proved virtually irreversible. It was a bitter lesson written in mudslides that desperate decisions made without regard for reality leave scars that do not heal for generations. And what about America? Do you think the big inch rusted away and became a monument to the war? Nothing of the sort. Pragmatic Americans found a new use for it. As early as in 1947, a consortium, the Texas Eastern Transmission Corporation, bought the giant pipe and converted it for transporting natural gas from Texas to the industrial centers of the Northeast. The war artery became the engine of a post-war economic miracle. It provided cheap energy to cities and factories which now produced not tanks, but cars and refrigerators, launched the gas industry, and for decades determined the country's energy landscape. The Big Inch did not die, it changed its mission, becoming a sword beaten into a ploughshare on a continental scale. Thus, the legacy of the war diverged down two different paths. One project left behind scarred land and a feeling of deep national shame. The other became a steel artery of prosperity and technological breakthrough. Scars on the land versus arteries of progress. This story brings us to the final main question. What lesson for us, for our time, is hidden deep beneath the earth, in those long-filled trenches and uprooted, decaying roots? Ultimately, this story is not about oil or pines. It is a story about two ways of looking at the world. On one side, engineering pragmatism. Americans faced a problem, submarine attacks, and found the most effective, albeit expensive, technological solution. They soberly assessed their resources, set a clear goal, and achieved it. On the other side, ideological desperation. The Japanese command, cornered by its own mistakes, fell into denial of reality. Instead of seeking a way out, it created a myth of fuel from roots and threw the entire nation into its implementation. The fate of the war was determined not only by the tonnage of steel, but also by the quality of thought, the ability of one side to make rational decisions, and the inability of the other to distinguish the will to win from the will to self-deception. Imagine an old man. He sits on the veranda of his home somewhere in rural Japan and looks at the thick pine forest on the mountain slope. He remembers that slope differently. Bald, scarred, pitted with holes. He remembers how his childhood hands, covered in sticky, unhealing blisters, uprooted those roots, feeling a dull ache in his back. He remembers the acrid smell of smoke that seemed to have settled in his lungs forever, and the constant gnawing feeling of hunger. He looks at this new, regenerated forest, and there is no joy in his gaze, only a quiet, hard-won sadness, because he knows that his childhood, like those trees, was sacrificed for an illusion that gave the front not a single full tank of quality fuel. We think that wars are won with resources, oil, steel, uranium. But this story proves the opposite. The most valuable and most scarce resource in any conflict, be it a war between nations or your personal crisis, is cognitive honesty. It is the ability to soberly assess reality, the ability to abandon a beautiful but non-working myth, the trap of sunk costs, in favor of a complex but effective solution. The ability not to confuse hope with self-deception. It is this resource that determines whether your efforts will become a big inch carrying energy and results, or simply smoke from a kiln carrying the ashes of vain sacrifices into the sky. Now, a question for you. This story happened 80 years ago, but isn't it relevant today? Look around in business, in politics, in your personal projects. What in our modern world is the equivalent of oil from roots? What desperate yet meaningless bet is being placed on comforting myths simply because it's scary to admit the truth? And what could become our big inch? What bold breakthrough solution can truly change the future, even if today it seems too complex? Where do you smell the smoke of wasted resources, and where do you hear the quiet hum of a gathering yet still invisible big inch? Think about it, and write your opinion in the comments.